Hey everybody, and welcome to chapter number 3. We are talking about cognition and perception in this chapter, but because we're going to be spending so much time talking about the visual side of things, I just titled this Visual Perception because so much of cognitive research and perceptual research, the overlap that they have, a lot of it is visual research. As we're going to see, the next chapter that we're going to be covering is about visual object recognition. And so that's part of the reason why there's a heavy visual slant in this chapter. The other reason is because just so much of what we know about the intersection between perception and cognition is because of visual information. And the reason for that is a little bit more complicated. It's mostly because humans see themselves, no pun intended, as visual creatures, and so for that reason, a lot of the funding for this, for our understanding of these topics, wants to look at visual information. So, how does color affect our mood? How does the legibility of handwriting affect our ability to process it? Those kinds of questions generally get priority compared to questions about hearing, and especially about questions about taste and smell and things like that. But we'll kind of touch on all of those ideas as we move forward. So what we're talking about today, I want to spend some time unpacking this topic that is going to follow us for the rest of the semester, and that is thinking about information as being processed from the top down or from the bottom up. So we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about the visual system. So how the visual system works, and we're gonna do a really quick flyby on that because I'm gonna try to boil it down to like a 20-minute kind of description rather than an entire semester worth of content. Because if you have taken sensation and perception with me, then you know that this can be multiple weeks worth of information that we talk about here, and it still feel like we're only scratching the surface. There's so much to know. And then we will talk a little bit about at the end how we put all that information together, how we are able to recognize very simple forms, so not quite objects, but things like shapes and contours and lines and edges, and then we'll conclude by talking about cognition across the other senses. So I have a couple of videos for you in the lecture slides here in case you were interested. The one that we are going to be watching together in this video is going to be this one right here. And so in just a few minutes we'll turn our attention to that. But there's a couple of other ones that I think might interest you. So if you're looking for some examples of top-down processing, this video will kind of give you an example of that. And when we start talking about some of the more kind of abstract kind of concepts in visual cognition, talking about feature integration theory and things like that. This is a link to one of the experiments that investigates that topic. So if you are kind of curious about what that looks like, again, no pun intended, you can find it there. All right, so just to kind of talk about this distinction between bottom-up and top-down processing. As I mentioned, this is going to come up a lot throughout the semester. You're going to see me talk about it in our book from time to time. But basically, the fundamental idea is this. It is that context matters, and how we approach the world around us changes how we perceive it. And I know that sounds at first blush that feels a little bit philosophical, but it's not. It's fundamental to the way that we experience the world. So let's talk about bottom-up processing first. What the heck is bottom-up processing? Bottom-up processing is whenever your experience of the world is informed by your senses. So in this way, it is data-driven, which is to say that I'm going to use an example to illustrate both of these. Let's say I find a cookie, and it is brown, and I can't tell much else about it. And I want to know what it is, so I'm just going to put it in my mouth and eat, right? This is an example of data-driven processing because I don't know. I know it's a cookie, which, is not gleaned through senses. That's gleaned through our prior experiences and through memory and concept formation, as we'll talk about in Chapter 9. But I see this thing, I don't know what it is, and so I try to use my senses to explore it. So maybe I put it in my mouth and I bite down on it and I chew, and I'm wondering, what does it taste like? that is a very bottom-up approach to this question, where I look at this object, I put it in my mouth to try to chew on it, to taste it, to see what it is, so that I can have some kind of idea of what it is that I have discovered. That is a little bit different than top-down processing, where top-down processing, you have kind of an idea about what that object or what that piece of the environment is, and that influences your perception here. So to give the same example, but this time with a top-down approach, let's say that I find this brown cookie and I look at it and I'm like, oh, interesting. Well, this is totally brown, and so I don't see any chocolate chips on it, so if it's totally brown, then it's probably going to be maybe a peanut butter cookie, because those are typically more kind of brownish looking than, white, so it's not a sugar cookie or a snickerdoodle or anything like that. And because it is this shape, that seems to be about the correct shape or size for a peanut butter cookie. And what I'm doing here is I have a preconceived notion about what it is that I am experiencing. And so I am going to start bringing all this other baggage to try to understand what that is, making decisions about it. So that's a very, very, straightforward example of top-down versus bottom-up. But it gets really, really complicated because we start using these processes together. Because for most of us, if you find a cookie on the table, you're going to pick it up and you're going to probably not put it in your mouth to eat first, right? Instead, what you'll do, you'll probably be like, I think this might be peanut butter, so you're going to break it in half and smell it. Oh, yeah, that smells like peanut butter. And so what you're doing there is kind of a hybrid, where you are combining your kind of hypothesis about what it is, your preconceived notion, and you're going to be combining that with some raw sensory experiences, in this case, the smell of it. And so whenever we go throughout our world, we experience things in a bottom-up fashion and in a top-down fashion. If we are relying on our senses to try to make sense of what is around us, then we're using bottom-up, data-driven approaches. And if we are letting our expectations guide that process, then we are using top-down processing. Let's look at, and actually just to back up for a second, I opened this by saying that context matters. So let me show you why context matters in this case. So if you were to see this right here, and I asked you, what does this say? Almost everybody would say this. They would say the or whatever, right? We got a T, we got a H, and we got an E. But if I were to show a second group, this right here, yeah, there probably will be some people who say that it says like cht or something like that, like CHT. But we're going to see some people say that it says CAT, right? And the whole point of this is that here, almost nobody sees this as the letter A, right? Why not? Well, because there's not really a very frequent word in English that is TAE. It's just not a likely combination of letters that we experience. But THE is a pretty common occurrence. And so the T on this side, the E on this side, we're going to resolve what this ambiguous stimulus is, what this brown cookie might be, by looking at what it is surrounding it. Oh, a T and an E, this must be the word the. Now, if we look over at this other word, and again, I know that some people, when they look at this, they may say CHT, and that's fine, but we're going to see a lot of people who read this as the word cat. Why is that? Well, because CHT, that's not an English word. It's not a word that we see very much, and for that reason, our mind is going to kind of pick out the outcome that is the most likely, while also being accurate, answer. And in that case, this ambiguous letter becomes the letter A instead of the letter H. Now, obviously, you can tell these are the same symbol. They are the same letter. They are the same array of lines, at the same angle, but we perceive them as different based on the context. That context, in this case, being the letters around it. So in both of these cases, we just used top-down processing because we used our notion about language, our expectations for language to inform this. It didn't have to be a conscious effort. It didn't have to be something that we thought about, but it happened nonetheless. So it is top-down processing in that case that tells us what this ambiguous letter is. Here is another example. So if I were to ask you, what is this right here? So say that out loud. Say this out loud, and this, and this. Okay. So most people are going to read this as 11, 12, 13, and 14, right? And if you did that, then you did a job well done. Good work. Give yourself a high five. Now, whenever I do this in the classroom, I'll usually have at least one or two smartasses that whenever they see this, they're like, and we're saying it out loud as a class, they're saying 11, 12, B, 14. Because you probably know, based on the last example, what this is going to be. And if you do know what I'm going to, the point I'm going to make, then you're using your top-down processing because you're using your expectations from a previous example and applying it to this example. But anyways, this is an ambiguous configuration, right? So it is the number 13, but it is also the letter B, right? So whenever if I were to ask you to read this, A, B, C, D, right? So in this case, we took that ambiguous configuration, and this time we thought of it as the letter B. Now, why do we do that? Because of the context in which surrounds that symbol. The context here is numbers, the context here is letters, and so we perceive them differently even though they are identical configurations here. So this reminds me a lot of what we talked about at the end of last chapter. So at the end of last chapter, we talked about how just looking at an image, that our eye can pick up of all this detail, right? So our eye is picking up on the house, it's also picking up on the face, but our instructions, whether we should focus on the face or focus on the house, changed the areas of the brain that were activated during this task. And that is an example of context influencing our brain activation, right? So when we talk about perceiving this as a 13 and this as a B, that is because our brains are processing that information differently than they would have if we just showed somebody this configuration without any kind of context around it. The same way that if you showed somebody this configuration and gave them no instructions, you'll probably see some activation in the fusiform face area and some activation in the parahippocampal place area as that individual focuses on both the face and the house back to back as they interchange those processes. So basically, the point I want to make about this is that top-down processing and bottom-up processing are going to inform a lot of our day-to-day experiences, and that context matters for how we perceive the world, and that this happens at a fundamentally neurological level, that the brain activation that is created from the context in which we experience the world changes how we perceive it. All right. Okay, so here is a more kind of a lingual version of this. So if you were to try to read this, go ahead and try to read it. So it says, your mind is reading this automatically without even thinking about it. Now, the fun thing about this is that obviously you can tell that not all of these letters are actually letters, right? So let's look at this right here. You were able to read this very easily as the word this, right? Even though there's really only the letter H here, and then the other three symbols are numbers, right? So we have the number 7 and we have the number 15. We have an H in the middle of it, and so because of our expectation of this being a sentence and that this must be a word because within this sentence it is spaced appropriately so that it is a word unto itself, and we see this H, and this looks like it could be kind of an I. It shares some features in common with an I. This shares some features in common with an S, so therefore this must be the word this. all this is happening extremely quickly without us really having to do that kind of logic and decision, like that rationalization, right? We didn't have to walk through explaining how this works to try to figure it out. We can just kind of like let our mind wander over these symbols, and it puts it together as a sentence for us because of our past experience with language and with information being presented like a sentence like this. Here's another example. So try to read this. It doesn't matter in what order these letters in a word appear. The only important thing is that the first and last letter are in the right place. The rest can be a total mess, and you can still read it without a problem. So this is an example, again, of top-down processing. And it's working basically the same way that this more complicated version is here. Except this time, instead of using numbers, we just have some of these letters are rearranged in the wrong order. But because the first and last letter give us the context of what this word might be, and because we have an expectation for what the next word's going to be based on what the previous word is, because we're fluent in this language, we're able to kind of figure it out with no problem. So that is top-down processing. All right, so again, this is going to be something that follows us throughout the semester. So just to recap, top-down processing means that your previous experiences, your previous knowledge about this information is going to affect the way that you perceive it and affect the way that you experience it. Bottom-up processing, just to drive a contrast here. If you were to show this to a baby, right? A baby has not learned a language. An infant does not know language, does not know how to read. So a baby would look at, these configurations right here and see them as identical and not be able to tell there's a difference here because they don't understand this context around it. So babies really operate through the world in a very bottom-up fashion. And in fact, usually when I'm thinking to myself, is this bottom-up processing or top-down processing? I think to myself, could a baby do this? Would this be what a baby experiences? Because if so, that's probably going to be more bottom-up, right? If you think back to the cookie example at the very beginning of this video, how does a baby figure out what it is? Well, the baby's going to put it in its mouth, right? It's going to look at it, and then it's going to put it in its mouth to try to figure out what it is. It's not going to, is not going to consult Google or an encyclopedia to try to figure it out. Okay, so let's change gears a little bit here and talk about visual perception now. So we are going to essentially cover the visual system in a really short amount of time. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because, number one, a lot of this information is in your textbook. Number two, not all of it we are going to be using that much this semester. The top down and bottom up, I took my time there because we're going to be talking about those ideas a lot. This, I might speed through some of the stuff because I want to make time for some of the other things that we're going to be applying through this chapter. Okay, so let's talk about how the visual system works. So we got these eyeballs, right? You got them. That's how you're watching this video right now, presumably, unless this is in the future and you're using some bionic eyes, which is possible because we kind of have that technology to some degree already. It's very rudimentary, though. But this is the eye, and just to walk through what's happening here, we have light entering in through this, and I'm just going to walk through and just kind of name what each of these pieces do here. So first, light is going to travel through this open, transparent structure called the cornea. This part of the eye that you don't want anybody to touch, that's your cornea. From there, light is going to pass through this pocket, which is called the aqueous humor. The aqueous humor and the vitreous humor are both filled with fluids that are going to really try to protect and rejuvenate the cells around it. So we don't have any the reason why we can see through our cornea is because we don't have any blood vessels there. We don't have like blood vessels through our cornea because we'd have to see through it, which means that we would not be able to see. And so we don't have a whole lot of blood circulating through our cornea. So instead, it relies on the aqueous humor to deliver those enzymes and nutrients to keep the cornea nice and fresh and healthy. From there, and actually. In the vitreous humor, anytime you have damage or old cells that were not repaired. They can be what's called floaters that float around in your eye, which I guess technically those can actually be in both of these pockets. But if you ever had like those floaters in your eye, that's where they are. That's where they come from. They're inside your eye. From there, light is going to reach this layer, and it's going to pass through the pupil. So the black dot in the middle of your eye, that is the pupil, the thing that the doctor, whenever you go get a checkup and they put that really bright light right there, they're looking inside your pupil at the back of your eye. Now the pupil is not actually a structure itself. It's actually a hole, which is how your physician is able to look at the back of your eye because they're looking through that hole. So it's not actually something black. It's just, it appears black to all of us because there's no light back here, right? There's no light sources, and that's important because we need it to be very dark in here so that we can detect the light that's traveling into our eye. So the pupil, this window, is kind of shaped and sized by the iris. The iris is going to be the part of your eye that provides its color. So maybe it's dark brown, maybe it is hazel, maybe it is light blue, like mine, as you can see, is kind of light blue. Maybe it's green or whatever. That is your iris, and the iris is a sphincter muscle, which is colored by pigment, which is what gives it its color, and it is going to open and close your pupil to either let in a lot of light when it opens it up, or to let in much less light whenever it is closed, which is why whenever you have adapted to night vision, your pupils are really big because your iris is allowing as much light as possible to enter into the rest of your eye. From there, light is going to hit your lens where it refracts. And so this lens, which is like a clear structure that is going to kind of quote-unquote focus the image. So basically we got this light coming in, it hits the lens, and the lens is going to refract it onto a point, just like a magnifying glass would. If you've ever messed around with that, you know that you can hold the magnifying glass at a specific angle, at a specific distance, in order to kind of I don't want to use the word refract again because I keep saying refract, but in order to focus that beam of light. And that beam of light is going to strike the retina, and the retina is filled with cells called photoreceptors. Those photoreceptors are going to be what transduces that light signal into a neural impulse. So if we want to look at where exactly does perception begin in the human experience, I think when we're talking about vision, this is generally where it begins. So all this visual data that comes in from the world around us is going to land on these neurotransmitters, which are called photoreceptors, and those photoreceptors are going to convert that into an action potential, if you remember that from last chapter. So this is where those action potentials are created, and then from there it consults the rest of the brain. And it's a very complicated process from there. But that is the big picture of it. You can see here this optic nerve right here. It escapes from the back of the eye and travels to the rest of the brain. The optic nerve, we don't actually see anything at all in this whole pocket right here in our visual field, which is really interesting, right? Because whenever you're looking right now, you don't see a big gaping hole in your visual field. And that's because our brain is going to use inference to try to guess what the best possible, most likely visual information would be that we see, and it just puts it there, and our brain doesn't even recognize it. It doesn't even notice that there is a black hole there. Really, really cool stuff. If you want to know more, you got to take Sensation and Perception with me in a different semester. I'm sorry. Those photoreceptors, we can break those up into rods and into cones. They are the two different kinds of photoreceptors. So let's talk about cones first. Cones are going to be more in the center of our retina. So in the center of our retina, we have mostly cones, and actually I should back up because I didn't mention the fovea. The fovea is just a fancy way of saying the very middle part of your retina. So we have mostly cones in our retina, and those cones have very high acuity. What does that mean? You can think of this as HD. So it is high resolution. And our rods, on the other hand, have low resolution. So it's like looking at standard def. Our cones are very colorful. Our rods can only see in black and white and gray. Our cones are very sensitive, so we are able to detect a lot with them, and our rods are less sensitive. So just a compare and contrast between those different kinds. You can see here a microscopic view of that, why they're called cones, because they are shaped like cones, and why they are called rods, because they are shaped like rods. Here's a really cool illustration to look at the distribution of these photoreceptors, where right here, and the way to interpret this figure is on the x-axis we have how far away in the eye compared to the retina, compared to the fovea. So right here 0 would be right in the middle of our retina, and then 20 would be 20 degrees away from our retina. 20 degrees away from our fovea, from the center. This would be 60 degrees away from the fovea. And then we have on the y-axis the thousands of photoreceptors per square millimeter. So 1 tiny millimeter, how many thousand photoreceptors do we have based on the type? So as you can see here at the very center of our visual field in the fovea, it is almost exclusively cones. That's where a lot of them are. But as we move away from the fovea, you can see that it drops extremely quickly, and then we have a kind of a baseline, array of cones, but not nearly as many as we have in the center of our visual field. And then if we look at rods, that we have almost no rods in the center of our visual field, but as we move a little bit away from it, we have a lot of rods, and as we move closer to our periphery, we just have fewer photoreceptors in general. And you can see in the blind spot, we don't have any photoreceptors because that is where our mind is just kind of doing its best guess about what should be in our visual system, and we just don't detect it. All right, I'm gonna skip over. Well, I'll talk about some of the stuff. I don't want to talk about bipolar cells really, or ganglion cells all that much. That's a little bit outside the scope of this class, but I do want to mention that after the eye, information goes to the thalamus. The thalamus is a sensory gateway, and it is going to help us pick and choose what information goes to the rest of the brain in terms of sensory signals so that it can be processed. Whenever you are asleep, your thalamus does a really good job of not sending signals to the rest of your brain, which is part of the reason why whenever you're sleeping and your roommate turns on the light, if you're a heavy sleeper, it doesn't bother you because your thalamus is holding the gate closed, is being a great gatekeeper and saying like, no light's coming in right now because the boss man or boss lady is fast asleep, and we don't want any of that. If you are a really light sleeper, your thalamus just might be extremely sensitive, where people who walk and talk in their sleep, it's usually because this sensory gateway hasn't completely shut down. But that's a little bit of a conversation for another day. Let's talk about the lateral geniculate nucleus. Well, I don't want to talk too much about lateral geniculate nucleus. It's just part of the thalamus, but this is where that visual information, after it leaves the optic through the optic nerve, it is going to reach the optic chiasm, where some of that information is going to go to one hemisphere, some of it's going to stay in the same hemisphere of the brain. There it's going to reach the lateral geniculate nucleus, where it is sorted. So we sort that information based on if it's a large piece of visual information or if it's a small piece of visual information, if it's a colorful piece of visual information. And then from there, it moves over to the occipital lobe, into the cortex, and it lands on the V1. The V1 is the primary visual cortex, which is kind of like the first level of processing that our brain does. Okay, so I'm going to now pivot over to a video. So this video right here is from, I believe, it's either I think it's the late 70s, where there were some researchers whose names were Hubel and Wiesel. Hubel and Wiesel would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Physiology for the work that you're about to see here. And what they're doing is they are measuring the visual field. They're mapping out the visual field of one specific cell. I'm going to mute this actually for just a second so that way it's not getting in the way of me talking. But what you're going to see here is that they have this light, they're shining this light, and when I turn the sound back on, you hear some popping sounds. The popping sounds are how fast that particular cell is firing. If you remember back from chapter 2, action potentials really, or neurons I should say, speak with how many signals are they firing out. You'll listen to those signals and you'll hear those action potentials that none of them sound louder than the other or quieter than the other, but that they sound like they're firing very quickly or not quickly, or it's staying the same. And based on that, they are drawing out essentially the visual field of this one specific cell, and what kind of information is making it fire and what kind of information is not. So I'm going to rewind a little bit and then play that sound for you so you can hear how they're diagramming this out. Okay, so hopefully you get the idea by now that it wasn't just that this light landed in this sweet spot, right? It didn't matter that there was light there specifically, but it had to be angled at a specific line orientation. So whenever this line kind of moved across and landed in this spot, we heard it fire more frequently. Whenever it was straight up and down like that and moved across, it didn't really, fire that cell didn't really fire all that much. And so essentially what they found is that for this one specific visual cell that is, part of our visual field, that it is going to fire frequently when it encounters lines that are at this specific angle. So in just a moment, I'm going to start talking about receptive fields. Receptive fields are these cells and where on these cells light would cause them to fire more frequently or less frequently. So where we get all that information is from research like this with Hubel and Wiesel, and as you can see, this video is 11 minutes long, and they are going to diagram out some really complicated neurons. As you see here, they're going to look at some neurons that are specifically interested not just in the presence of light, not just the presence of light specifically at an angle, but that light needs to be at an angle, moving in a specific direction, moving at a specific velocity for that cell to wake up and start firing because it's sensitive to that specific kind of stimulus. So we have lots and lots of extremely specific, very dedicated cells in our visual cortex back there that are going to help us kind of see things around us. Sorry, the reason why I kind of laughed, and you might have to rewind to see if you can hear it, one of my dogs is sleeping right underneath my feet, and he's dreaming right now, and he's kind of like barking in his sleep and moving in his sleep, which is funny because we just talked about that with the thalamus just a moment ago. You can see my other dog, Fozzie, who's almost always here recording with me. He's over there in the back. He almost never moves because whenever I'm recording videos, he knows that it's work time and that it's time for him to nap and for me to do my business. But he's always here as my sidekick to make sure that I'm staying on task. All right, so those visual cells that I was talking about, they have these receptive fields, and let's take a look at how those receptive fields work. So this specific cell right here, if light were to land on the center part of that cell, it is going to fire more frequently. If you have light touching on the outer part of that cell, it's going to fire less frequently. That is exactly what we saw in that video. Now, it wasn't perfectly shaped like a circle like this, but it was shaped like this, right? So let me erase this a little bit. It was shaped like this, where the center part of this was excitatory, it would fire more frequently, and the part on the surroundings, it fired less frequently. But we also have other cells that respond in just the opposite way, where if light were to land on the center part of that cell, it's going to fire less frequently, and if it fires on the periphery, it's going to fire more frequently. So these receptive fields, we understand, occupy that back part of our occipital lobe, and so all the incoming information from our environment that was turned into an electrical impulse, that is how it is communicating. That is how we are going to understand our visual world around us, and from there, these individual cells that are all firing at different rates depending on where information is in the world around us, that communication of those cells we are then going to recognize as lines, curves, edges, and eventually forms, shapes, and objects, faces, and letters and words and things like that. Just to kind of recap some of this, like, for example, if you had light, and this might be self-explanatory, but if you had light on the center part of this cell, it's going to fire more frequently. If you have light on this part of the cell, it's going to fire more frequently as well. If we have light here on this cell in the inhibitory surrounding, it's going to fire less frequently. And then for this specific cell, if it's in the inhibitory center, it's going to fire less frequently. All right, so I want to return back to our visual system and how context matters here for processing. So looking at this, and I love this example because it's so effective. If I were to ask you if A and B are the same color, what would you say? I know what you would say because you're a psychology major, you're really clever, and you would say, haha, yes, they are the same color, professor. And I would say, yeah, but do they actually look the same color to you? And then you shift around in your seat because if you're being honest with yourself, even though you know A and B are the same color, they do not look like they are the same color. I've been teaching this class for almost 10 years, and I still think that these and I've seen this illusion for far longer than that. I remember seeing this illusion back when I was in college as well. I still feel like A and B look like different colors, even though I know that they are not different, that they are the same. So if you don't believe me, I'm going to remove the context. So basically what I'm telling you is that top-down processing, just to kind of show you where we're going, I'm going to spoil it a little bit. Top-down processing and our expectation for what we are seeing means that we do not perceive this shade and this shade to be equivalent. But to prove to you that they are, I'm going to remove the context. So here we go. You notice I removed some of the checkerboard. Now I removed that entire cylinder. I'm removing other parts of the checkerboard. Oh, now, okay, so to me this A and B kind of look different still. Now they don't. They look the same now. And especially now they are the same. So basically whenever we isolate the context, when we get rid of that context, when we're just getting that stimulus by itself, we can see that they are the same shade. But when we look at the big picture, they do not look to be the same. So why is that? That is because of top-down processing, essentially, where we are taking the information that we see around us and trying to make an informed guess about what it is that we're seeing. And when I say informed guess, again, this is not a conscious thing. This is something that our nervous system is automatically doing without our permission. So why is it that B appears lighter to us? Is because of something called color constancy. Again, this is something that I talk about in a different class. I'm not going to really talk about it in this class because it's we're only really going to talk about it for this, these next couple slides. But color constancy is this notion that I'm factoring in that there is a shadow over this tile, right? It looks like that this cylinder is casting a shadow, so that what my retina is perceiving here is actually a little bit darker than it is in reality. So my brain is going to kind of tweak my understanding of the lighting levels here. And so now I feel like this stimulus is actually a little bit lighter because I assume that a shadow is cast across it. But also the checkerboard, right? We're moving from light, dark, light, and then over here we got light, dark, light, dark. And if that's the case, then this should be light, this should be dark, right? But again, it's just an illusion. It is a trick. That is not actually how this appears. And we just saw that because when we remove the context, when we are not able to use those top-down processing strategies, we see that they are the same shade. The same applies for this kind of illusion here as well, where you have these different lines, and if I ask you which of these lines looks longer, and I don't mean, don't worry about, you know, the stems and tails of these, don't worry about the tails and heads of these arrows. So so don't worry about this part of it, you know, and don't worry about the extra part up here. Just the line in the middle. You know that they are the same length, right? Because you've probably seen examples like this before. But even still, it doesn't look to me like they are. It looks to me like this is the longest, and that probably this one right here is the shortest. But we know that it's not, because when we actually measure and compare, we see they are identical, but that is because our context, this other additional visual information, is throwing us off. All right. Let's see. I'll mention this a little bit here. I was debating about whether or not I should even talk about this right here, about lateral inhibition. This is a famous example of something called lateral inhibition. Basically, if you look at these different grades of shading, we got dark black here, we got dark gray here, slightly less dark gray here, and so on and so forth. But the interesting thing is that we have these lines, right, that are created from these sudden abrupt shifts to a different shading. And if you look at these lines, it looks like these lines are a little bit darker than the rest of this side or the rest of this side. So essentially, those cells, because those cells are all across our retina, as we can see here, they're all laid out right next to each other, that some cells that are being excited by visual information right here are then going to be inhibited by the sudden change on the other side of it. And that strong signal between those two cells tells us that we are likely seeing a line. This is how our visual system is able to put together lines and edges and contours, is from those, listening to all these cells and which ones are firing and which ones are firing less frequently, and then extracting some kind of meaningful interpretation of that. So that's why it looks like we have lines here when in fact there aren't actually any lines present here. It is because of some of those nearby neurons are excited and the ones right next to them are inhibited from the same thing. All right, so let's talk about the what versus where distinction in visual processing. So now is a great time to take a quick break. If you need to do that, go walk the dog, go grab a bag of Funyuns or whatever. Okay, so here, this is where we've been spending most of our time so far when we've been talking about processing of visual information. We've been talking about that a lot over here in the V1 of the of our occipital lobe. Here we got our cerebellum down here. That thing that looks like broccoli. That's what that is. And so we've been spending a lot of time here, and just to orient ourselves, here is our eyes. So our eyes, we got visual information coming in here, hitting up the thalamus, and coming to the back of the head. From there, Once it reaches the V1, which you can see here, it is then going to spin off into a lot of different other areas, and it gets really, really murky, really, really fast because there are so many different connections to keep track of. I'm going to simplify a lot of that stuff. So if I was talking about this at a graduate level, I would maybe not simplify it so much. But the simplification works for like 99% of most visual information that you're going to be encountering in the world around you. So let's take a look at what we call the what stream of information. Whoops, I got those backwards. Where we got the what stream down here on the bottom, and the where stream over the top. Okay, so looking at this right here, we see from our occipital lobe that information is going to go in two separate streams. One over the top of the head, and then one which we're going to call the dorsolateral way, the dorsal stream, and then we have the ventral stream. And if you have any issue remembering those words, dorsal and ventral, and which one applies to which, I always remember dorsal because of dorsal fin. If you know, like a shark or a dolphin, that fin that sticks out of the water, that's called the dorsal fin. And so if you were to like lay on your stomach and you had a fin coming out of your head, that would be the dorsal part of your head. It's a neuroanatomical phrase, dorsal. That's where that comes from. And now's a really good time for me to talk about LL Cool J's song where he talks about how his hat looks like a shark's fin. Never mind. That's a really stupid rap reference. Don't worry about it. But it's a really silly song from the 90s. Where was I? Thinking about old school hip hop. So the ventral stream here goes underneath, and the ventral stream is usually referred to as the what pathway. So let's take a quick look at those two different systems. So the what system, this would be where we are going to categorize and recognize what something is. So it's concerned with the identity of objects. We're going to talk more about that in the next chapter as well. But there's a really great video here if you are interested in what might happen to somebody who damages this area. So if you're ever curious about, well, how do we know that what an object is travels in this stream, and where an object is travels in this stream? If you want to know how we know this, is because of lesion studies. It is because people have gotten into accidents and damaged this part of their brain, and we see what happens to their perception and to their cognitive processes after those kinds of accidents. So if the what stream, if that ventral pathway is disrupted, it leads to something called visual agnosia. And visual agnosia is the inability to recognize common objects, even though you can perceive them directly in front of you. So if you were to damage this stream, which usually is damaged to what's an area called the inferotemporal cortex, or the IT cortex, if you damage this stream, you would be able to look at this and say, like, that is next, you would look at this and say, like, I know that you're holding something, and I know that it's white, and I know that it's not super big, but I cannot tell you what it is. And maybe you'll say, like, well, that's not a fair example because that person's a gamer, and so maybe they're not a gamer, and so they wouldn't know that's an Xbox controller. So let me give you an example with a mug. Everybody knows what a mug is, right? If I showed this to somebody with visual agnosia, they would say that they know that I'm holding something. They can tell me about how big it is. They even might be able to tell me the rough outline or shape, but they wouldn't be able to tell me that it is actually a mug. So that is the what system. The where system, so the location of objects, is in the top part, as we mentioned. And whenever this area is disrupted, it leads to achinotopsia, or motion blindness. And again, this linked video shows you a little bit like what the world might be like if to experience it if you can't see motion. And the fascinating thing about achinotopsia, and what has to do with the location of objects, is that if you can't perceive motion, then you can't tell where objects are moving. And so if you have a kinetopsia, you damage this part of your brain, then you see the world as a collection of still images. So a bunch of images like a slideshow almost. So you can hear that somebody's walking, but you won't know for a second or two if they're walking towards you or away from you or from side to side, because that picture needs to update. So it doesn't really create this nice fluid sense of motion. Instead, it's like we see things frame by frame. All right, so this distinction is a conundrum that that has plagued psychologists for quite some time, called the binding problem, because we have these two systems operating in the brain separately and independently for the most part. So in other words, if you were to damage this part of the brain down here, you're still able to tell where things are, no problem. So that's the double dissociation. In other words, I can damage this area and it doesn't affect this area, and I can damage this area and it doesn't affect this one down here. So if I were to damage this up here, then I couldn't tell you where things are, but I could tell you what they are. So how is it then that if I were to ask you, what am I holding? You'd be able to tell me I'm holding a mug. And then if I asked you again, well, where is that object? You'd probably be like, it's in your hand, duh, right? Because it seems like such a simple, obvious question. If you know what something is, then you can say where it is in front of you. But that's actually a tough kind of problem for us to talk about, because what it is two streams of information that are independent, and yet they don't feel independent to us. It feels like one unified whole experience that we have. This is known as parallel processing, where you have two separate streams of information that happen independently in the brain. So we don't see the world as disjointed, even though that is kind of how the brain is processing things. It is breaking things up and doing it separately. So why do we not perceive the world that way? The answer is, in order for us to solve the binding problem, we're really going to be talking about attention, and we'll be talking about that in chapter 5. But to talk a little bit about it for now, to kind of get your appetite ready for this, is that the reason why our brain is able to put together these streams of information is using attention to glue those perceptual features together. So this binding problem, why is it that we perceive the world as a unified experience instead of a bunch of fractured, recognition processes? It is because attention is gluing it all together. And we know this because of some research that was done in the 80s by Anne Treisman. Anne Treisman is one of my very favorite cognitive psychologists. And she's no longer with us, but she did a lot of research on perception and attention, and she kind of cracked this problem by doing a bunch of experiments that shows that whenever there's a lot of visual information in front of you, or your attention is maxed out, that you're more likely to make conjunction errors. And I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. But those conjunction errors tell us a lot about how we perceive the world as a bunch of independent, smaller parts instead of a unified whole. The other part of this is what's called neural synchrony, where with neural synchrony, because things happen together, because they happen at the same time, our brain generally attributes them as having the same source. So that is part of also why we perceive those things to be the same. So here's an example. Now pay attention to these words here as I go over them. Attention is critical for binding visual features. When attention is overloaded, and this is really important, people make conjunction errors. More on this later. And okay, I will admit that was a trick. I tried to get you to really focus on this because I was going to show you something over here on the right, and I didn't want you to have a whole lot of attention over there. So if I was in a classroom, I would ask, well, what did you experience whenever I flashed that image in front of you? And usually there's a lot of variety in the answers. People will say it's a rainbow, or they'll say that it was a mug, or they'll say that it was a clown, or they'll say that it was whatever. But usually there's a lot of mistakes that we have there. If I were to show it to you and ask you to place your attention on it now, you can see very clearly, oh, it's a vase and a bowl of fruit, right? And the reason why we can recognize this as a vase and bowl of fruit is because we're paying attention to it. And we're able to now use some object recognition processes that we'll talk about next chapter to put those shapes together. So I want to move on a little bit from this for now, because we'll talk more about some of the stuff next chapter. So to shift gears yet again a little bit more, and we're kind of entering our final stretch here, I want to talk about form perception. So how we are able to recognize very rudimentary shapes. Before cognitive psychology was around, which again, remember, is kind of new, kind of came around in the late 50s, early 60s, Gestalt psychology was huge in Europe, and based on the name Gestalt, you can probably guess it came out of Germany. But their big motto, Gestalt psychologists, is that the sum is greater than the parts. So what does that mean? Basically, whenever somebody says this, they mean that, like an example would be like, oh, I don't want to give too controversial an example, but if I were to say like One Direction, the band One Direction, for example, some people say that they are a sum greater than, that they're greater than the sum of their parts, or that the sum is greater than the parts, which means, and actually no, I feel kind of guilty saying, I'll go through it. So that One Direction, that you take the 5 young guys who were there, and the global phenomenon of One Direction at the time was way bigger than the fame of any one individual, and that the commercial aspect of it, so how their ability to sell records was bigger than the individual 5 of them. And even if you took those individual 5 and added up their commercial sales together, it's still not as much as when it is all together, right? So Gestalt psychologists in Europe were not thinking about One Direction whenever they came up with this. But you could apply it to the Spice Girls as well. That's the first group that I thought about, but I'm a 90s kid, so I know not all of you are, so you may not have thought about them immediately. But a lot of boy bands and girl groups are exactly like that, where they are the sum is greater than the individual parts that make them up. So here, basically what they are referring to is that our perceptual experience is greater than just the individual aspects that make up our perceptual experience. So if you think about like vision, for example, I can look at a mug and I can recognize this as a mug. And what I'm doing there, just by glancing at it, is that I kind of recognize the structure and some key elements of it, and then my mind just throws together the rest. And so because my mind is quote-unquote throwing together the rest of that information, that's an example of how what I perceived is greater than just what I saw, if that makes sense. That what I experience is more than just what I detect with my eyes or with my ears. All right, so Gestalt psychology was really interested in personality. It was really interested in perception as well, and these researchers pointed out a number of grouping rules from Gestalt psychology. So let me give you an example of some of these. So if you were to see this array right here, and I asked you, tell me what this is. Most people, when they see this, they would say, oh, this is 4 columns of circles, 2 columns are tan, 2 columns are red, right? So that's a very different answer than what a baby might say, right? A baby would probably recognize this, and a baby, I guess, wouldn't say anything. A baby would just recognize this as like, a bunch of different colors. And well, actually, I shouldn't invoke babies here. That because they're not going to be talking about it. So maybe that was a bad example. I apologize. That I did not say that this was 16 objects, right? I did not say that, oh, half of these are red and half of these are tan. I kind of made a point that there were like 2 columns that were tan and 2 columns that were red. So what I've done is I have grouped together the columns that are similar. And that is kind of an inherent thing that humans do. That without us really having to think too hard about it, that we have these Gestalt grouping principles in our brain, which we refer to as middle vision, that are going to, and I should put middle vision in case you're curious about that, that group those for us. Same with this. If I asked you what's going on right here, you'd probably say there are 3 groups of dots. Not that there are, 16 dots, on the screen, but there are 3 groups of dots. So we tend to group things whenever they appear to be close to one another. So we perceive these to be 3 groups because of their proximity to one another. Here's an example of what's called good continuation. If I asked you to say what's going on in this image, you'd probably say that we have a cylinder and behind it we have a green rectangle that stretches behind it. Nobody's going to say that or most people are not going to say, we got a cylinder and we have 2 green rectangles on either side of it, because our brain inherently perceives that this line is going to continue behind that cylinder. For closure, for this one, we see this as, and sometimes you'll hear this called like illusory contours. And so in this case, if I asked you what is this, you'd probably tell me, oh, it's a triangle with some parts of it missing. Not, it's 2 lines, which is technically what it is. That this is just 2 lines, but our, one is like a V, and then the other one is kind of like that. Our brain sees this as a triangle, even though it's just these 2 lines that one's higher than the other one. And then finally, we have simplicity. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as, no, I was going to say sometimes you hear it referred to as good fit, but that's not always true. So in this case, if I were to ask you, like, what is this object right here, you'll probably tell me that it is 2 rectangles, one going in this direction and then one going in this direction. But you won't tell me that it is 4 separate shapes, like one like this, one like this, and one like this, and one like that, right? So you wouldn't do that because you can tell that using the process of good continuation, that it's probably going to be just 2 of those lines. Here's another example of illusory contours, as I mentioned. Good continuation. I like this example because the illusion is it looks like, that this grass is continuing. So it looks like she's empty, right? But really what she's doing is she's holding up a mirror so it's reflecting in front of her and catching that yard line right there instead. All right, I'm going to skip over some of the stuff. I want to get to this point. We're going a little bit longer than I hoped, so I apologize for that. I thank you for your patience. So in this case, we see a cow. Oh, no, I can't believe I ruined it. I can't believe I ruined it. Oh, my gosh, and I can't back up. So what do you see here? My bad, y'all. What do you see? I got another example, so that's why I'm not going to just delete all of this. If I asked you, what is this image right here? Most people, if they didn't hear me give it away, would look at this and they would say they don't know. They look at it. Sometimes I'll hear people say it looks like an ink blot drawing, or it looks like maybe a skull of some sort. I don't know. But this is a really deteriorated picture of a cow. And if you don't see it, here is the cow's head. Right there. You can see its eye is right there. We got its nose right here. We got little parts of his hair right here. We got its ears hanging out right here. And so there is our cow. Now, the fun thing is that now if you do see the cow here, and it's got its head hanging over this fence, at the camera. So if I were to erase that outline, And if you look at this cow now, so it's going right back to where we began. Now it doesn't look like nothing. It looks like a cow. You can't unsee the image, which is why I laughed, because once you know what it is, you can't unsee it. That is an example of Gestalt psychology in action, because here we see a cow even though not all that information is present. We don't see the rest of the head. We don't see this part of its face. We don't see the continuation of its eyes or of its nose, or that these are supposed to be ears. But our mind populates that information for us. Here is one more example. So what do you see here? What about now? And again, I'm giving you some more context. What do you see now? Some of you might see that this is a dog, and that this dog is sniffing at the ground. So if you don't see it yet, here is the nose of that doggy sniffing at the ground. We got its shoulder up here, its back. It looks like it's got its tail pointed over there. Its back right leg right there. Its back left leg right there. Its front left leg right there. Its front right leg right there. Looks like maybe a collar right here. Its floppy ear, and then the rest of its head. So you can see it sniffing down at the ground. It's got its tail all pointed or whatever. It looks like maybe a shadow of a tree, trunk over here maybe. I can't tell if this is maybe supposed to be a sidewalk. I don't know. So we got a Dalmatian on our hands, folks. But if I were to get rid of all of those cues, if I was to get rid of all that, and just go back to the very beginning here, and I asked you, what is this? You would tell me that that is a dog, because now you cannot unsee that perception of that dog. You can't unsee the illusory conjunctions of its form. So this is an example of form perception and of these Gestalt grouping principles, but is also an example of top-down and bottom-up processing. So whenever you're looking at just this right here, and you're using your bottom-up data-driven senses here, you're just looking at it, it could be hard to tell exactly what this is. But when you have an expectation of, oh, I'm supposed to be looking for a dog here, and that dog is supposed to be right here, now it kind of pops out at you. And once you have that knowledge of what this is, you can't go back. You can't remove that knowledge. And so we continue seeing it as it is here. Or not as it is, but as it's not. All right, we got some figure ground stuff right here. I'm not going to talk too much about that because, it's either chess pieces that we see here in white, or we see in black the two guys facing each other, kind of having a conversation in both cases. Two guys having a conversation, so they got some cool hats on their head and they're wearing some robes. All right. Let's see. I am going to, and again here, if I were to ask you, how big is this dog? You would know this dog is the same size as this dog, right? Because you can see how big this chair is, and you know that in relation to this chair, how big that dog is. So it can't be a gigantic dog. It's not like Clifford the Big Red Dog, right? It's not as gigantic as a house. We can use these cues about how big the tiles are, how big the furniture it usually is, to make an unconscious inference about how big or how small visual things are in front of us. Here's one more illusion. So this table right here, it looks like this table is maybe longer than this other table, the surface of it is, but it's not actually. That this table is the exact same. And if you don't believe me, because usually when I talk about this in the classroom, there's some haters out there who aren't going to believe me. Let me just put the haters to rest here. That what I'm doing, I'm getting rid of all of that. I'm using my expert PowerPoint skills, as you can see. Ta-da! It is the same, right? It is exactly the same shape and everything, and yet it still looks so different whenever it is at a different line angle orientation. So again, that is an example of context influencing what we see and what we perceive. Now, the final thing that I want to talk about is a couple of the other senses. We could spend more time highlighting some of these, and we will throughout the semester, but I wanted to touch on a couple of big ones first that are non-visual. And this one is visual. Well, I guess they're both. The ones that I'm going to talk about are synesthesia and the McGurk effect. And both of them are visual to some degree, but you can see how they add in other visual elements too. So the McGurk effect, I'm just going to show you what it is first, because it's way better if you experience it this way first. So definitely turn off your subtitles if you can, because I want you to try to guess what this individual is saying.
Ba 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 ba.
Okay, so most people, when they hear this the first time, they tell me that they hear the words B-A, B-A, B-A. Ba 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 ba. Okay, let's look at the next one.
Ba 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 ba.
Okay, sorry, I did not mean to pause that. It's such an unfortunate face that he is making. But again, usually, I would say that most of the class, whenever I give them this example now, will say that it sounds like he was saying va va with a V-A. Va va, va va, va va. Let's look at one more.
Ba 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 ba.
Okay, and in that one, usually what I'll hear is that people will say that he is saying either T-H-A or V-A again. So tha or va, either way. Now, the trick to all of this, which some of you may have caught on to, is that in all of these cases, the audio is the same for every single example you just watched. Every single time you heard the same syllable over and over. B-A, B-A, B-A. And yet, the visuals were different. Sometimes, in this first one, he's making a B sound with his lips.
Ba 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 ba.
And so we perceive it as ba ba correctly. Now watch what happens when we keep that same sound, but we add in a new different visual for his lips.
Ba 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 ba.
Sorry, this one.
Ba 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 ba.
So in this one, I'm hearing either T-H-A or V-A, va va, because as you can see, his lips are doing something different. The audio is the same, but the lips are doing something different, and so your mind is trying to reconcile those differences. And what it does is eventually settles on a middle ground. It looks like he's making, actually I'm going to mute it. What sound do you think he's making? Looks like maybe he's saying D-A, like da, 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 da. And that paired with the audio of a B, we hear as a V. One more example.
Ba 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 ba.
Again, it's still B-A, B-A, but whenever we take out the sound, it looks like, if you watch his lips, it looks like he's doing a V or an F. All right. And then now it's going to put all these together. And so what I would invite you to do on this is to listen, but look at the lips for each one. As you do this, as he talks, you'll probably hear that sound a little bit differently each time. In some cases, you'll hear it correctly as B-A, 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 but then other times you'll hear it change depending on where you are looking at for each of these individuals. And if you turn around and don't look at any of them, if you listen to this entire video again without any visuals, you'll just hear B-A, B-A the entire time, and you'll wonder why it was so confusing.
Ba 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 ba, 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 ba ba.
All right, so that was the McGurk effect in a quick nutshell. So the reason why this happens, and I should also say that, depending on how you're listening to this may also affect how you perceive it. So if you're wearing Bluetooth headphones like I am, sometimes there can be a little bit of a delay, and that delay between sight and sound can disrupt the McGurk effect. So it works best usually if you don't have on if you don't have on headphones, because it reduces that latency, and so it feels even more like that sound is coming from those lips, even though they aren't, and you know it. So this is called the McGurk effect because it was established by John McGurk and MacDonald in 1970s, and basically they pointed out that this is because of top-down processing, because our expectations based on what we know about language influences how we perceive those sounds. And that's because we have spent so much time around other speakers that we know that when their lips are making that specific sound, that we are expecting a sound to match what those lips are doing. It's not every day at all that we come up to somebody in the real world and their lips are moving and something other than that sound that they are creating comes out, right? That doesn't happen very much. You might see it if it's like dubbed language, where somebody's doing like a fake lip reading video or something like that. So if you're watching a Korean movie and it's dubbed in English, you might experience some of these effects too in the wild, but generally they don't occur that much in the wild, which is why they are so powerful, because we typically use top-down processing to extract what that person speaking is saying. All right, so if the hearing and audio cues are in conflict with one another, our brain will try to find some explanation that satisfies both of them. So if we know that based on the lip formation that they're not saying BA, because we can see them doing this with their lips, where they're not pursing their lips together to produce the B sound at all, but we also know it can't be GA because it doesn't sound like ga ga. That must be then that what we're actually hearing is DA, because it is kind of somewhere in between these two percepts. Now, this initial paper by McGurk and MacDonald, and it's only like 3 pages long. It's worth a read. It's really interesting. They did the same test with kids and found that kids didn't really experience this at all. And their explanation for this actually had to do with the television, with that because people are around and watch so much TV that they're able to kind of put together these sounds and sights because of all of our years of experience doing so and having conversations with people in a language. Kids don't have as much of that. And so kids will rely a little bit more on hearing or a little bit more on visuals, depending on the kid. And so they don't combine those sensory signals like humans do. And then finally, we're going to wrap up by talking about synesthesia. So synesthesia is this really fascinating condition where you have people experiencing senses where you would not expect them to. So an example of this would be like if somebody says that they can see the way that something smells. And I don't mean that figuratively. I mean like that, like if they smell something, that they kind of see the source of that smell as being kind of greenish or kind of orangish or kind of brownish or kind of bluish. Or if somebody might be able to feel numbers, where if I say, well, what about 16? And they say, like, that one's kind of prickly like a cactus. Well, what about the number 37? That one is kind of smooth and chrome around the edges. What about the number 42? Well, that one has really sharp corners on the top but not on the bottom. So synesthesia is actually maybe a little bit more common than you might expect. Some estimates suggest that it's about maybe 5% of the population. Some people think it's as much as 10%. Some people think it's as few as 1%. But usually, when I'm teaching this class, I'll have at least one person across both my sections that will fess up and talk about their experiences with synesthesia. And so you might have synesthesia. And a lot of people who have synesthesia don't even know it until they're in college, because it's not until that point where they realize that their everyday experience is not the same experience that everyone else in the world has. So the most common version of synesthesia, to give you a better kind of idea of how it works, is called color grapheme synesthesia. And color grapheme synesthesia is where whenever you look at a letter or you look at a number, it has some kind of color property added to it. So some people who see the number 3 might see that as kind of yellowish. The number 4 is kind of greenish. The number 5 is polka dot, white and black. Number 6 is tie-dye. Number 7 is a really strong green, and so on and so forth. The interesting thing about this is that it doesn't matter what time of day you show somebody those numbers, or or what else they're doing. They always consistently see those colors. So it's not just as simple as that they have put together some kind of classical conditioning association here and learned some kind of association. It's really like in their brain they perceive it as being that color as well. So that's the most common version of synesthesia, is color grapheme synesthesia, and we'll touch back on this in a second. But we can also have auditory tactile synesthesia, which is where sounds elicit some sensations to us, which is one of the leading explanations for ASMR, if you've ever heard of the autonomic sensory meridian response. There's lots and lots of videos on YouTube that look at this, that have people listening to certain sounds, and they like those sounds because it makes them feel good. It feels like they have a chill running up and down their spine. That's an example of auditory tactile synesthesia, where a specific sound is felt, and that is strange because we don't feel sounds like that. And I know if you're listening to some really, really loud bass, that can vibrate you, but that's not because of the sound or the qualities of the sound. That's because, well, it's not because of how should I put it? It's not because of the quality of the sound or what's being said that's doing that. It is literally because the air is shaking and is causing you to shake as well whenever that happens. So why does this happen? Why does this stuff occur? It occurs because in our brain, we might have some networks that don't commonly talk to each other, that might have a few extra connections, and so whenever that area of the brain is activated, it inadvertently activates the other neighboring area. So I'm going to show you on this screen a list of the number 2, and I want you to count how many 2s you see. So if you are scanning through this, you'll probably find, and I'm going to go ahead and ruin it, there are 6 of them. You'll see one here, 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 and here. So those are the 6. So if you had to scan for them, then you do not have color grapheme synesthesia. People that have color grapheme synesthesia would see this as easily as this, where immediately and automatically these numbers have a color that is paired with it, which makes 2 stand out really, really easily from 5. And hey, what is this task that we just did? That's called visual search. You may remember that from, was that chapter 1 that we talked about that? And we were talking about how, yeah, you remember that. Anyways, these all happen basically without us being consciously aware of them, or without even trying to. They happen automatically. And the neurological evidence for this suggests that it's mostly just because of, a couple of neurons are communicating when they don't for most people. So here's an example here where we have the area of the brain that is usually responsible for processing letters and numbers is right next to the area of the brain that helps ascribe colors. And you can see, like, if this area is activated and you have a couple of neurons that are communicating with this area, it might cause this area to be activated. And so we assume that those things are related because of feature binding, like we talked about earlier in the chapter, that because they occur together and close together, we assume that they are happening as part of the same thing. One really weird example of this is a guy who had vision taste synesthesia, and he admitted that he hated driving because the road signs would look like something that would cause him to experience ice cream and earwax on the surface of his tongue. So when he would look at a road sign, he would have this really god-awful taste in his mouth because of his synesthesia. So that's another, I just want to give you these two examples of these odd, interesting ways in which vision can interact with other senses to create some truly strange cognitive phenomena. Thanks for tuning in. We're going to be checking in with Chapter 4, which is going to be a little bit shorter than this one, by talking about object recognition. So we're going to be putting all these pieces together and looking at how we go from these really simple shapes into recognizing people's faces and recognizing words and recognizing other complex phenomena. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.